Hello, my name is Gage Hawes, and today I'll be covering defensive formations, specifically what a defensive formation looks like, including its shells and the amount of players it has, as well as how we label them and how they look generally in their base form. To begin, we need to understand how a defense gets labeled. Defenses are labeled by their down linemen, dash the amount of linebackers, and then in some cases you dash and then DBs. An example of this would be a 4-3 defense, 4 down linemen, 3 linebackers. Or inverse, a 3-4 defense means there's 3 down linemen, 4 linebackers. Some defenses you do all terms, so you'd say for a nickel defense, you might have a 4-2-5, which just means 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, 5 defensive backs. There is a 4-6 defense, the 46 defense, which doesn't follow this, but that's its own type of defense. But generally, most defenses follow this down lineman, linebacker, sometimes defensive backs labeling. Another area to develop our understanding of defensive formations is what type of defense it is. A base defense generally has 7 players within the box or 4 defensive backs inversely. This would be like in a 3-4 defense. Since there's 7 people in the box and 4 defensive backs, it's generally a base defense. Or a 4-3, which has 7 in the box, just different than the 3-4. And these are the types of formations that traditionally your defense would be based around, as they would be your first and second down formations. And then moving upwards in defensive back counts or downwards in the amount of players in your box. With 5 defensive backs, we get a nickel defense. So this would be a 4-2-5 or a 3-3-5. This just tells us 3 corners and 2 safeties. Just a more pass-oriented defense. This is the more popular standard in the NFL now, as it's become a more passing league. So having 7 players in the box generally makes a defense too slow to cover that. So the nickel defense is much more closely to what you'll see on a given play rather than a base defense now. We can even take this one step further with 6 defensive backs, which is called a dime defense. So this would be like a 4-1-6 or a 3-2-6. 5 players in the box, 6 defensive backs. Generally, just 4 corners, 2 safeties blanketing the top. Although you could have defenses where it's 3 deep safeties and 3 corners. But every defense is different in that regard. But generally, we only see 2 high on a given defense. And in theory, we can expand this even more to 7 defensive backs, which would just be called a quarter defense. This would be a defense where we have only 4 players within the box. So maybe 1 down lineman and 3 linebackers, or 3 down linemen and a linebacker, or even a 2-2-7 in that regard. But this is a defense that really isn't ran in the NFL. It's more of just a concept. And then reversing all the way back, defenses with only 3 defensive backs are considered heavy defenses or run defenses, and are typically only used in short distance or goal line situations where we're selling out more for the run game and just kind of blanketing off everywhere else. So versions of this could include the 4-4, the 5-3, or the 6-2, or even the 46 defense, which has just 3 defensive backs, truly. And these defenses do excel at making sure that the box is contained at the cost of fast guys in coverage. The last little bit of defensive distinctions we can talk about are the shells of a defense. This just refers to the amount of players that are deep within a given defense. The most common shell now is a 2 high shell, which means 2 safeties deep. Another really common one is a one high shell, which only has one safety, generally right in the middle over the top of the offense. But we could also have a 0 high defense, which doesn't have any deep defenders, or a 3 high defense, which has 3 different deep defenders, or as many other variations as you can put deep. To start, I'm going to go over the base defenses. These are defenses of 7 box defenders and typically includes a 4-person rush, mainly out of a 4-3 or a 3-4 defense, but technically also includes the 5-2 defense, which is more of a run-stopping defense as it generally sends 5 players. These defenses traditionally have 2 high deep defenders, so it'd be a 2 high shell, but they can also bring down a safety to mimic a 1 high shell type of defensive coverage structure. The 4-3 features 4 down linemen, typically in an overshift or shifted towards the strength of an offense's run game, and the linebackers fill in over the empty gaps between the defensive linemen. This defense is a single gap defense, which just means that each person will have a singular run gap responsibility. This is a super simple defense for the defense to work around, as gaps are generally obvious without any additional scheming or stunting. But that also means it's pretty easy for the offense to diagnose it, which is why it can sometimes be frowned upon. But its simplicity helps. If your players are dominating, this defense generally doesn't fail unless you start getting into spread offenses where your linebackers slow you down. Inversely, the 3-4 defense features 3 down linemen and 4 linebackers, 2 of which are on the edge positions. This defense has the ability to stunt really hard and has a variety of different blitzes that throw off an offense, and typically has one of the linebackers rush in to help put pressure on the pocket. This defense is more varied in the gaps, with sometimes you have multiple 2 gap defenders, or you have players flow across the formation, or some defenses even use the set strength to dictate where their defensive gaps come from. But this defense is more complicated and more varied, but is a lot more complicated and can lead to some issues. Not typically at a higher level, but on lower levels of play, it can be especially obvious to have more confusion. But it's still pretty effective as a defense, or particularly within the run game. However, it does lack strongly in coverage, as generally your 2 edge players are a lot bigger than your normal off-ball linebacker in a 4-3. So you can have bigger pockets within your coverages, which could lead to more yards gained through the passing game, which is why the 3-4 defense can be a little bit frowned upon in that regard. This contrasts with the 5-2 defense, which is a more souped up version of the 3-4. In this defense, we're generally sending 5 down linemen at the quarterback, but this also only leaves about 6 players in coverage unless you pull one of your defensive ends who are not trained to be in coverage, which makes this defense's issues really clear. You're not going to have a lot of players flowing. You will be able to match up against an offensive line, but you're going to get caught with coverage. That's why this is not really a base defense. It's more of a substitute in for a run situation type of defense. Base defenses may have been the common defense in the NFL for a long time. However, with more pass-heavy offenses, the sport has clearly shifted towards running nickel defenses, which help protect against the passes of spread offenses while not completely selling out their ability to protect against an offense's run game. The most common form of nickel is the 4-2-5. This just features, as mentioned, 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, 3 corners, and 2 safeties. This defense is used to protect from spread offenses and has a variety of different alignments to help keep the gaps varied. But to keep things simple for this video, I'll only cover the most basic form, which just has an over front. and each player generally has just one gap responsibility. This just allows for an offense to protect and keep up with the speed of, say, 3 or 4 wide receivers instead of just 2, while not completely selling out their ability to protect against an offense's run game. This is a really important defense for second and medium, second and long, where typically you're getting a 50-50 chance of a run or a pass, but you don't want to completely give up a big play down the field because you're stuck with only 4 players who can keep up with receivers. Another form of nickel is the 3-3-5. This defense generally has 3 pairings of linebackers and defensive linemen that can vary in their gaps to keep the offensive line guessing as to where explicitly a defensive lineman or a linebacker is going to go. Typically, one of the linebackers blitzes within this defense to maintain a 4-man rush, but this defense also means that we can have a little bit more guys in coverage to help protect against the pass at the cost of a reduced ability to rush the quarterback. That's generally why it's not used in the NFL, because in the NFL, we try to have just a 4-man rush, get to the quarterback. That is peak defense within the NFL. The 3-3-5 doesn't really accomplish that. That's why it's kind of frowned upon in comparison to the 4-2-5. The step up from the nickel defense is the dime defense. These defenses are useful in long passing situations or empty set defenses where having speed and coverage is an absolute necessity. The most common form of dime is the 4-1-6. This is an even defense with 2 outside and 2 inside corners evenly split to both sides of the field, 2 safeties in the shell, and 1 linebacker commonly placed over the center. This defense sacrifices run stopping ability to sell out for the passing game while still maintaining that 4-man rush that we like to see. Another form of dime is the 3-2-6. This just further sells out against the run and suffers from the same issues as other odd front defenses where we're not explicitly sending 4 down linemen, but it still has more players that are faster for coverage, so you can have a little bit better of a coverage opportunity in a defense that's focused around coverage. However, most teams understand that only sending 3 comes with a big risk of having the quarterback have, say, 6 seconds to throw the ball. Well, if you give up 6 seconds, chances are the ball's going to find somewhere to go, which is why teams like to have more players rushing. So we could see a linebacker blitzing in this type of defense, but the base form of it generally only has 3 players rushing. While extremely uncommon, there is in theory another defense with 7 defensive backs, referred to as a quarter defense. This would be seen in the 3-1-7 or 1-3-7. This defense doesn't care about the run game. It just kind of sends players more to prevent the quarterback from just sitting and waiting forever. But we have 7 defensive backs, generally 3 or 2 safeties, and the rest are over the top of a receiver. This is just the biggest sellout to a passing game that we can see within just a general defense that isn't prevent. And the lack of rushers is the exact reason why this is never used. There's just too many defensive backs and not enough rush. It doesn't matter how many guys you have deep. If the quarterback has all day to throw, he will find somewhere to throw it, or he'll just take off and get the yardage that he wanted. Another form of defense that sells out to the pass is called a prevent defense. These defenses, if we're saying that a defense is a prevent defense, we're talking about a defense that spreads its coverage players across the field to just blanket it and prevent a score rather than an actual genuine defense. These are defenses only used on like 1 second left, 2 seconds left, where only really one play is going to get thrown out there and it has to be a score for the offense. That's the only time we really see this defense. If you see it outside of that parameters, it will fail pretty much every time, just because you're going to let up a huge amount of yards running prevent. You're using prevent to stop a score rather than as an actual defense to prevent yardage as just a normal defense. Prevent isn't that. Reversing backwards, we can start to look at the heavy defenses. These defenses only have 3 defensive backs and typically stay within a single high structure. The 4-4 defense is a personal favorite of mine, being a balanced defense with 4 pairings of defensive linemen / linebackers. This defense helps smother the run while still having the ability to sit back with 7 players in coverage like a base defense. This is a simple defense, typically seen within lower levels of play, but it can still generate great pressure from a variety of places due to the amount of pairings within the defense. Another heavy defense is the 5-3. This defense is more commonly seen as a goal line defense, which rushes 5 and can blitz with the linebackers to increase the amount of pressure from there. This defense also allows for each receiver / eligible player to have an assigned man responsibility with room to either have a spy or an extra blitzer. The last defense I will cover is the 6-2, which is like the 5-3, but increases the pressure at the cost of the extra player in coverage, which means that the rushing players will be responsible for the quarterback rather than having enough guys to cover each player, including the quarterback. There are many different types of defenses, and utilizing the right one at the right time for a given situation is how we build success on defense. We can only do so much out of changing formations, but utilizing the right formation with the right personnel is how we maximize the amount of pressure we put on a quarterback while also maximizing our ability to protect against the pass. Defenses that succeed within a given situation are going to be the defenses that prevent huge opportunities. Having the right players out there and having the right defenses and going through and making sure that the players you get are right for your defensive scheme is how we build a successful defense. If you have 4 down linemen on the field at all times, and you pick up 2 defensive end guys who are specialists within rushing and protecting the outside, and then you grab 2 defensive tackles who can flip between being, say, a 2 tech or a 3 tech or a 4 tech or even a 0 tech in some cases, and you just work with your 4 down linemen, maybe alternate 1 or 2, but you work that. Well, maybe you run a 4-3, a 4-2-5, and a 4-1-6, right? Or even a 4-4. Building a defense around the specific group of formations and making sure that your players understand what to do in each formation and utilizing the right formation in the right situation is how we get success. Not just breaking something with the same formation, but alternating and understanding what works and what doesn't work is how we, or a given coach, build success on defense. Let's review. The components of a defensive formation center around the amount of players in each position group and its shell. A base defense has 4 defensive backs, such as the 4-3 and 3-4. Heavy defenses have 3 DBs, like the 4-4, 5-3, and 6-2. Nickel defenses have 5 defensive backs and include the 4-2-5 and the 3-3-5 defenses. Dime defenses have 6 defensive backs, like the 4-1-6 and the 3-2-6. Quarter defenses have 7 defensive backs, like the 3-1-7. And prevent defenses spread players across the field to prevent a touchdown in a Hail Mary situation. In future installments, I'll start covering the many different varieties of coverages a given defense can have. Generally, this is pretty simple, but individually covering each coverage, I believe, will help a person understand. So I'll go in depth within each type of coverage, from cover 1 to cover 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 and to 9, as well as what a cover 0 is and what we mean with certain different types of phrasing, and build an understanding of what coverage looks like. Thank you for watching.